Dr. Jerome Dobson.
Thank you, thank you. On behalf of the American Geographical Society of New York, it is my pleasure to welcome you to our Fall Symposium, Geography 2050. Thank you for joining us as we look ahead to the future of the discipline, technology, and real world of geography. AGS was founded in this city by leading statesmen, mercantilists, abolitionists, jurists, and geographers who understood the true value of geography in business, government, science, and society. How fitting it is that we meet today in Low Memorial Library, named after Seth Low, second mayor of the consolidated city of New York. At the time of his election, this remarkable man was the sitting president of two venerable New York institutions, Columbia University and the American Geographical Society. AGS has been a vibrant part of the city and state of New York since 1851. Franklin D. Roosevelt was a member of our council when he was elected governor of New York and president of the United States. Note the trend here. And Mr. Baker, you might want to mention that to Mrs. Clinton when you see her. For 163 years, AGS has been a leading advocate for geography in the United States and around the world. Our mission is to advance and promote geography in business, government, science, and education. We helped site the Transcontinental Railway, Transatlantic Telegraph Cable, and Panama Canal. In World War I, Woodrow Wilson commissioned AGS to lead the analysis of foreign intelligence. We drafted his 14 points and supported him at the Paris Peace Conference. From 1925 to 1945, we mapped all of Latin America at the finest scale available until well after World War II. We helped lay the foundations for geographic information systems. The first GIS research article ever published in a mainstream geographical journal appeared in our Geographical Review. Over the past decade, we promulgated a new world standard for cartographic representation of landmines, minefields, and mine actions. We conducted a nationwide survey to gauge the American public's knowledge and values regarding geography. We led 6 Bowman expeditions to foreign regions. Today, we reassert our faith in the public and dedicate ourselves to the cause of popular geographics. This symposium is tangible proof that we have remained true to our original calling. This meeting of minds is essential because geography's future is uncertain as it has not been since the mid-1400s. Yes, geography is booming as enterprise, technology, and popular movement. If ever there was any question that geography is foremost among professions, the last shred of doubt was dispelled by economic reports over the past decade. U.S. Department of Labor, The Guardian newspaper, Money magazine, and other pundits stated our case: low employment, high salaries, rapid industry growth. Simultaneously, however, the goose that lays those golden eggs is being kicked out of school. I quote from an authoritative source: geography has been offered to fewer than 1 in 10 United States secondary school students. Departments of geography are being eliminated from American institutes of higher learning, thus endangering the discipline of geography in the United States. Traditional geography has virtually disappeared from American schools, while still being taught as a basic subject in other countries. That blunt indictment comes from the Congressional Record, Public Law 100-39, signed into law by Ronald Reagan in 1988. It lauds the many virtues of geography and warns of dire consequences. Yet the word itself has lost its meaning to vast segments of the American population. The last time it went away, we got the Dark Ages, when for 1,000 years there was no word for geography. We aim to spark a national discourse on the ever-growing importance of geography and the uniquely American folly that threatens it. Here and later, we aim to assemble diverse leaders who may not otherwise have the opportunity to interact. We will provide many opportunities for discussion, debate, and collaboration to further the cause. We sincerely thank our partners in today's symposium, the Earth Institute of Columbia University, the Open Geospatial Consortium, the United States Geospatial Intelligence Foundation, we deeply appreciate our sponsors, Boundless, Human Geo, MapStory Foundation, National Solar, and Spatial Networks. And finally, I thank the two people who have been most instrumental in conceiving and organizing this symposium, AGS Executive Director John Konarski and AGS Counselor Chris Tucker. Unfortunately, our host, Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Earth Institute here at Columbia, cannot be here today. Jeff is flying from Brisbane to Berlin to Belgrade. However, he sincerely wants to greet you and has recorded his message. Please play the video.
Hi, I'm Jeff Sachs, Director of the Earth Institute, and so sorry that I can't be with you today. So many friends, heroes, people I admire and learn from together at Low Library today, and alas, I have been off in Brisbane, Australia for the G20, and am returning as of today through Berlin and Belgrade on my way home. So I've missed this fantastic launch of Geography 2050 and this fantastic partnership with the American Geographical Society and Earth Institute and many other partners that is being launched today. I think most of you know how much I love geography. I come from a profession, economics, alas, that thinks that countries are organized by alphabetical order. Unfortunately, economists tend to look at lists often or Excel spreadsheets rather than at maps and place. But we know that it is the physical geography and the human geography that are shaping the global society and the dynamics that we now face. And geography as a discipline, I think, is having a most remarkable flowering now, precisely because it's so urgently needed to understand the changing face of the planet and how changes caused by natural processes and by human processes are now rebounding to have fundamental implications for human society. The topic of Geography 2050 is crucial. We are in the Anthropocene. We're in the age where humanity has become, like it or not, and generally without much thinking, the most important and most dangerous driver of Earth processes. We are trespassing on planetary boundaries, whether it's climate change or nitrogen and phosphorus flux, or changing ocean chemistry, and of course changing and often degraded habitats caused by land clearing, deforestation, pollution, over abstraction of groundwater, overuse of surface water, and the list goes on and on. With 7.3 billion people on the planet and a world economy now reaching $100 trillion a year, several hundred times larger than in the pre-industrial period, it's not altogether surprising that we're having such a monumental and in so many ways hugely adverse and dangerous impact on the physical Earth. We need geography. We need to draw the linkages of place and human dynamics to understand what we're doing to the Earth and what nature is going to do back to us through interactions that sometimes are only dimly perceived and are not yet part of our social or political recognition. The topics that Geography 2050 will be taking on, the changing demography, human migration, changing locations of human settlements, increasing coastal orientation at the very time that ocean levels are now rising because of anthropogenic climate change, is one of the many topics. The changes of climate itself with its profound impacts on food production, on extreme event risks, on the hydrologic cycle is a second. And of course, the tools that modern geography brings to the table, remote sensing, GIS information systems, the ability really for the first time to have a deeply sophisticated, interconnected model of human, social, and economic dynamics and physical earth dynamics, exactly what we need. And the place where that is going to be centered is in the discipline of 21st century geography with its links to public health, to economics, to resource dynamics, to ecology, and the study of biodiversity and all the rest. Well, these are central topics. I'm thrilled with this new project. I can only emphasize how timely it is, not only because of the centrality of the issues, but because in 2015, just starting weeks from now, will begin the most important global negotiations on the future of development orientation at the global scale that we've had in years and perhaps in decades, and that will help determine the direction for global policy making for decades to come. In 2015, there are 3 critical summits that will come one right after the other. In July 2015, heads of state will meet to consider financing for sustainable development. And then just 2 months after that, at the United Nations headquarters at the end of September, will be the largest ever gathering of heads of state on the challenge of sustainable development. 3 days high-level summit, which will culminate in the adoption of sustainable development goals to help orient the world around a holistic vision of economic development, social inclusion, and environmental sustainability. And then at the end of 2015 in December, of course, will be the culminating climate negotiations at COP21 in Paris. Well, Geography 2050 is at the center of the challenge of sustainable development. This project can provide remarkably important tools for the years ahead as the world grapples with a new framework of financing, a new framework of sustainable development goals, and we hope, and I have some growing confidence, a new climate agreement which will give us the direction, the mandate, and the framework to pursue both decarbonization of the world's energy system and adaptation and resilience to the climate change that's underway. All of this, once again, is to thank the American Geographical Society. Thank you, Jerry Dobson, for your leadership and for your partnership. I want to thank all of you that have come together today. I pledge, of course, the strongest possible support of the Earth Institute in the years ahead in this multi-year project. I want to thank our really outstanding core of geography leadership at Season, which does so much to keep us at the cutting edge of geographic analytics and therefore to be able to be a good partner with all of the leaders in the room. Have a wonderful time at Columbia. Please accept my hearty welcome, and I very much look forward to hearing all of the successes of the meeting.
Please welcome the program chair of today's symposium, the creator of MapStory.org and AGS counselor, Dr. Christopher Tucker.
So I have a lot of words to stumble through this morning, mostly to set context. So thank you Jerry. Thanks, Jeff, somewhere over in Europe at this moment. And thanks to all of you for attending our annual symposium, fall symposium, Geography 2050, Mounting an Expedition to the Future. And I'll talk quite a bit about that this morning. So we've taken to calling this the inaugural event of a multi-year strategic dialogue that helps us think about the vital trends that are going to reshape the geography of our planet. My job this morning is to explain our thinking behind this very different kind of expedition and what we'll be doing today. So we're really fortunate to have a fantastic raft of speakers here, and we're equally lucky to have all of you. You haven't seen the attendance list, but it's actually an astonishing array of people from academia, from industry, NGOs, social sector, and government. And it's not often that we get an opportunity to get together and think about the future of our planet because we're busy doing our jobs in very different worlds. So all of us are here today because we're concerned about the future of our planet. And we all understand that there's a lot of important trends that will reshape this planet, and they're best understood in terms of space and time, in terms of geography and how it changes over time. What better way would there be to understand these trends than to discuss them and their underlying factors and their impacts in terms of specific real-world geographies? Many of us come from the technical side of the discipline, and many of us come from the policy side of the discipline, and oftentimes we don't get an opportunity to talk about the concrete geographies that are out there and the geographic problems. Geography's long been a historic and descriptive science, right? Back in the day, if a leader wanted to understand the challenges they might face in politics, in war, in colonialization, then they would go to their geographer and they would ask about the world around them, and they would get the context of that worldly knowledge that they needed. But with the rise of the social sciences, I'd say the quantitative social sciences in the 20th century that had that I guess they kind of donned the mantle of the predictive sciences, geography and even history, were really looked to less by some leaders. And we've kind of had a dip that we've all lived through as a discipline. But some interesting things have really happened in geography as a discipline over the past few decades. With the rise of geographic information systems, quantitative spatial modeling, you can go on in terms of the scientific modeling techniques that array what we know about the world in space and time. It's offered up this opportunity to all of us as a discipline to seize that leadership, and once again, the geographer and the geographic thinker, right? Not just geographers themselves, are poised to provide leaders and citizens the kind of thought leadership that we need to understand this future planet as the geography of the planet changes. So what's Geography 2050? Hopefully you've been asking yourself that question, and if you know the answer, that'd be great. You can just hop up here right now. Our friends at the Earth Institute, when we first approached them and had this conversation, they said, you guys mounted these expeditions to the poles, founded in 1851. You explored the American West. That's how mapping was done. That's how you understood the world. Aren't you kind of mounting an expedition to the future? And we quickly wrote that down. And that's really what we're trying to do. It's a different kind of expedition. But think about the seriousness with which you would mount an expedition to the poles or to the American West, right? The resources that you would amass, the risks that you would take, all of the people that are involved. You didn't do those things with a lack of seriousness. But yet we're going into a very uncertain future in 2050, and this is an opportunity to actually convene with that same level of seriousness and the amassing of those resources to understand what this uncertain future is going to be. So this is really, we're thinking of this as a standing process by which geographic thinkers, practitioners, and interested citizens can convene as a community and systematically pursue this future. Throw things out of the data that we think represents this future that we're going to face and openly debate it. Bring different disciplines, bring different perspectives together so we can create a better understanding of our future planet. So, we're kind of doing this in the marketplace of ideas. So into the marketplace of ideas comes Geography 2050. If we do this right, we can collectively change the way in which our global society understands the future of our planet. There really is no institutional dialogue for this, where everyone can come together. And we hope that Geography 2050 as a multi-year strategic dialogue will be that opportunity. So how is this going to work? I'm glad you asked. So let's begin with the structure of this inaugural event. So today we have some phenomenal speakers to help us understand our future planet in the context of these major trends. There's only so much time in one day. People would come up and say, well, what about this topic? And what about that trend? And couldn't we cover that? And I said, in 8 hours, it's going to be tough. And here today, it's not meant to be exhaustive. We're setting a stage. And really, we're hoping to engage you as thinkers with some trends, so you can come back to this as a community with the trends that you believe are going to reshape the planet and those underlying factors. So we're going to start with the future geography of population, identity, and well-being. There's a logic to all this. Think about it. It's those people, after all, those darn people, that are doing so much to reshape our planet, whether it's with urbanization or amassing wealth or having environmental impacts. It's those people, and that's really where we start. We move on to climate risk and uncertainty, not entirely about climate, though we'll start there. There's many other risks that we face, where climate is only one. And there's, climate risk and opportunity. And there's opportunities like in the Arctic that have opened up because of climate change and many other factors. So we're going to have a great opportunity to think about those that we face. Then we move on to the future energy landscape. And we have great voices from industry and academe that are going to help us understand the future geography of that energy landscape and its impacts. Because after all, those humans, we kind of have this insatiable thirst for energy and all the great little things that it does to enhance our quality of life. So our lunchtime keynote will help us understand what it means to kind of prospectively think about the global security environment. Robert Cardillo, the head of NGA, and also the person who's delivered the presidential daily brief to the president for the past 4 years, will talk to us about how the national security community has thought about that, and how geographic thinking can actually improve that as the new head of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. This afternoon, we actually shift over to more technically oriented panels about the future of geography of Internet of Things. Some of you may say, yeah, that's cool, and others will say, I don't know what he's talking about. But we have some great speakers to really help us think forward to 2050. The Internet, ARPANET, only started in 1969. And think about the impacts that it's had in this short time frame of less than 50 years. So I think it's a meaningful conversation. And then we'll have our God's Eye View panel. A lot of people said, God's Eye View, that sounds inappropriate. But really, what did we do? American Geographical Society would mount expeditions, physically go somewhere in order to map. And over the past 30, 40 years, we've spawned all of these technical means to understand our planet, whether it's from space or through mobile technologies, et cetera. And we have some great industry leaders here today that will be talking about that. So throughout the symposium, you're going to be asked to dig into your own experiences and expertise. And I want you to think critically about the trends that will reshape the geography of our planet. Over the course of the day, and inspired by the speakers, we've assembled here today, you'll be asked to fill out each of those cards in your packet. Did anybody actually go through their packet yet? There's colored cards. And we'll tell you what color and what to do. So it's your thoughts that will actually prime the pump of Geography 2050 as a multi-year strategic dialogue. We don't want to have just a program committee make stuff up and you attend once a year and boy, isn't that a great event. It's literally about you driving the intellectual discourse. So we have some exercises here. And eventually, we believe we'll be able to raise an entirely new cohort of American Geographical Society fellows that help drive that dialogue. It's not just up to us as counselors and the leadership of the AGS. It's you who will hopefully come in as AGS fellows to help drive that dialogue in the direction you believe it needs to go. So we'll be looking for you to help us understand the trends that will reshape geography of the planet, but also to understand the gaps in technologies, in data, in methodologies, in capacities, the laws and policies that we need to invest in order to get ahead of the curve and understand how it is that we can understand the changing planet and possibly even reshape it to the benefit of society. So dig into your registration packets. Find card number 1, the pink card. I'm asking you during the first set of speakers to think about the 10 vital trends that will reshape the future geography of the planet, whatever you think they are, and write them down. Maybe even share why. There's only so much room on that card, but all of you have thought about this. Everybody thinks about the future, and we want to understand what that is. No rush. Listen to the speakers, enjoy what they have to say, let them provoke thought in you, and then write that down. We'll collect the cards later. Don't worry about the logistics of all this. Your Geography 2050. Everybody get it? Just nod your heads. Good. So, hopefully this has provided you some guidance of what you need to do for us to have a successful symposium. This is a participatory thing. We have breaks. You need to meet each other. You need to share. I have other exercises coming with those other cards. So don't fall asleep. As symposium chair, I would really just like to thank all of you again for taking time out of your day. It's hard to get to New York City, well, except for the people. Actually, we have people late who are from New York City, and that's okay. We appreciate the time and effort you've taken to get here. And we'd really like to thank the Earth Institute for their partnership in all of this, for the great venue, for the logistical support. They've been a fantastic partner. To the OGC, again, to the USGIF, and all of our partners from industry, thank you so much, because literally, without your financial support, this would not be happening. So thank you very much. Now, I'd like to introduce the one and only Geographer of the United States, Dr. Lee Schwartz, who has some comments and will help us by moderating the first set of speakers today. So thank you very much. Have a wonderful symposium.
I was told to enter from the side, and I'm paying attention to my marching orders here. So, thank you, Chris. And I'd like to, first of all, thank the American Geographical Society and the Earth Institute and the various sponsors here today for lending support to this landmark event. This meeting marks the first, as Chris said, in what is a planned series of events that we hope will galvanize professional geographers in the commercial, academic, and applied fields to contribute more directly, collaboratively, and effectively to the crucial public policy debates of our time, and to help develop a template for future engagement. For those of you who don't know, and I'm assuming that's most of you in the audience, the Geographer of the Department of State is a position that has been around in one form or another since 1921. It is a rather unique position with few direct counterparts in other countries. It is also a rather lonely position, given that I have few counterparts even in my own government, since most geographers who work in government are not plying their trade in a foreign policy-making organization like the Department of State. And while, as Jerry Dobson noted, the job market for geography graduates may be strong and growing, the influence they wield at the top levels of public policy has not seen a commensurate increase. In fact, geographers, including those who use current geographic tools and methodologies, have for more than half a century now ceded public and popular discourse on key foreign policy issues in this country to political scientists, economists, journalists, and those from other disciplines who in most ways are less well-trained and less prepared to understand and evaluate many of the key issues of our time, including ethnic conflict, climate change, food security, infectious disease, resource use, urbanization, sustainable development. I could go on and on. The Professional Geographer Journal, just this month, for example, had an excellent article on the spatial analysis of emerging infectious diseases. Yet where is our professional voice during the current Ebola crisis in Western Africa? Similarly, where were we when Haiti's reconstruction was being planned or Afghanistan's government was being formed? We were making maps, interpreting imagery, providing accurate metadata, promoting standards for relational data sets, and participating in volunteer mapping exercises to empower dispossessed citizens. I'm not dismissing these contributions, they're huge. But when critical strategic decisions are being made by political leaders throughout the world with serious implications for governance, well-being, sustainability, and conflict prevention, we need to aspire not to be the ones who are turned to merely for a map or an image. Thank you. I've tried myself and unfortunately failed on several occasions to create a position I've called the Chief Geographic Information Officer to coordinate international emergency and reconstruction response efforts with a position that's defined not to sit with the IT and technical specialists, but rather alongside senior government officials and international decision makers and financiers. My arguments have apparently not translated very well to donors, to organizations with legacy systems in place, nor to those with vested interests. But I know now that to make this argument successfully in the future, it will require a collaborative effort by a wide range of stakeholders who recognize the power of geographic information in the hands of people who know how best to interpret and to apply it. I am passionate about geography. This is a sentiment that I know I share with many of you here today. And since I received my geography PhD right here at Columbia, holding this meeting at Low Library for me is somewhat bittersweet, since Columbia eliminated its geography department more than 25 years ago, which is kind of hard for me to say. Makes me think how long ago it was I roamed this campus. But this closure of the geography department actually came towards the end of a trend that occurred in particular in graduate education, when many of the top universities in the country jettisoned their geography departments. Jerry Dobson has spoken quite compellingly about this trend, which he refers to as the American purge of geography, and in so doing, he has pointed out that America stopped teaching geography after World War II and has not won a war since. It's just something to think about as we move forward today. I wear two hats at the Department of State. One is a congressionally mandated responsibility for how international boundaries and sovereignty issues are depicted on all U.S. government maps. So please don't get me wrong, I love maps. I get aggravated, in fact, towards the trend of using such terms as situational awareness and common operating picture and data visualization to describe what are essentially maps that depict changing events over time and space. But everybody loves maps, and maybe that's part of our problem. The map is often seen as the end instead of the beginning. The other hat I wear at the State Department is the director of the Office of the Geographer and Global Issues in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where I oversee a program of analysis, both via maps and written assessments, on events that impact foreign policy decision-making. Global issues that we define in this context are considered to be those that are transboundary in nature, such as human rights, refugees, environmental and food security, and so on. These so-called soft power or smart power issues have actually received a great deal of saliency, I'm pleased to say, under the past two Secretaries of State. So they're becoming mainstream issues in our foreign policy priorities. These issues are also critical components of what Jeff Sachs identified as the underpinnings of the UN's post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals, with resilience and sustainability being the linchpins of development policies being formulated at both USAID and the Department of State. But the lead really on designing and implementing many of these projects that need to be undertaken in the name of sustainable development is likely less and less to be driven by governments and increasingly to be determined by technology innovation and public-private partnerships, and guided, one can hope, by concepts such as corporate social responsibility and open data. My office at the Department of State more than a decade ago made a conscious effort to reach out to entities outside of government by forming the Humanitarian Information Unit as an unclassified division within the Office of the Geographer. The Humanitarian Information Unit is a U.S. government interagency center that's designed to coordinate, integrate, analyze, and disseminate information critical to mitigating the costs and consequences of complex emergencies. And over the years, we have engaged in a number of community-based mapping projects, fostered a network of partnerships with African geographers via the provision of commercial satellite imageries, an area where there are gaps in our data extraction, supported the development of population estimation methodologies, and promoted best standards in knowledge management practices. One of our recent initiatives we called Imagery to the Crowd. This is a methodology that has now been instantiated at the State Department in a project called MapGive, which we promote as crowdsourcing diplomacy in an effort to enlist the State Department's network of citizen diplomats into the volunteer technical mapping community. And this technology is now being broadly applied throughout a wide range of user communities and will be showcased, in fact, in a number of initiatives around the country this week as part of National Geography Awareness Week. One such event that is being billed as this week's flagship event, it will be hosted, or digitally hosted at least, at the National Geographic Society on Friday, where I will be hoping to launch a mapping party which is focused on this year's National Geography Awareness theme of food security. So this is exciting stuff, and it's actually kind of fun. Finally, I'd like to say a few words about human geography, because I've been, for the better part of the past decade, trying to mainstream the use of the term and the concepts of human geography throughout the U.S. government. There have been many competing programs and terms being used to try to map social and cultural factors and data. This is difficult stuff. We can't do it. We can't collect human geography information via satellites. We have to do it by partnerships. We have to do it by collaborating, by empowering local people to map their own human milieu, if you will. I use the euphemism that we need to build a satellite to collect human geography information, and that satellite is built through partnerships, and it needs to be funded and resourced as well. Governments think nothing of spending millions, billions of dollars on electro-optical and other platforms that collect digital terrain data and other information, and yet we think that human geography information can be collected accurately and efficiently with little investment. And I think that's a fool's errand that needs to change. But in order to collect this information, we need to understand what our priorities are. We need to understand what the critical gaps are. We need to. I think Jerry Dobson, again, I've referred to Jerry several times here. He was actually a Jefferson Science Fellow in my office at the State Department several years ago. So we've collaborated on a lot of ideas, and he's in the American Geographical Society have developed Bowman expeditions, which is one way of getting good human geography and other information into databases where they can be used effectively. And I think that's also critical, because we can't make the mistake of just trying to get information to fill a map if that information is not good information. I think that tends to be the trend that we're heading towards, and we have to be very cautious when we're trying to map information that is inherently very difficult to map. So let me just use my call for better efforts to collaboratively work to get human geography data worldwide efficiently and collaboratively collected as a way to introduce this first topic on population identity and well-being. Obviously, the foundation for human geography is population. The importance of understanding peoples and social networks has to do with, in very many ways, identity that's difficult to really get a handle on and even more difficult to map. And the goal of all of our human security priorities are to promote well-being and good governance and all the other things that we can do by a more fuller understanding of the information we need to get. Is Deborah here? Yes, thank you. I'm very pleased to introduce our panelists. I think maybe they should come up and have a seat on their chairs that are sitting here. You have the bios in your packets. Hey, Deborah. Well, I see these chairs sitting here, so.
Sounds like a good idea.
I'm misbehaving and coming up with.
That's okay.
Yeah.
So, and I think what we're going to do is give them all a few minutes to speak, and then we'll have questions directed at each speaker. Somebody needs to tell me what my time constraints are, so we can try to stick to a schedule. And like I said, I'm Deborah and Alec I've known for many years, and Dr. Kruk I've just met, but I think this is a great way to kick off the session. And without further ado, I'll turn the microphone over to Dr. Balk. Thank you.
You can have my seat if you prefer.
I was told to sit here.
Okay. Thanks. Thank you, Lee. Thanks for having me. I understand my slides are going. Oh, there they are. And let's see. So, I will start. Is that visible? I can barely see it. Can you see it? I guess there's not much to do about the light. Okay. Well, Let me start by establishing some demographic truths, and then I will that lay the groundwork for the 21st century. And then I will go into some of the nitty-gritty about why we have some difficulty in understanding or preparing for these inevitabilities. The first is that the future world is irreversibly urban. The bulk of the future population growth will take place in the cities and towns of Africa and Asia primarily, and to a lesser extent in Latin America. There will still be also in North America, but overwhelmingly future population growth will take place in the cities and towns of Asia and Africa. The future world is also increasingly urban. This means that there will be a greater number of old persons. This is a population pyramid. Women are on one side, men on the other. Those are 5-year age distributions. And as you can see, the top of that pyramid is rather narrow, but by 2050, it will be getting increasingly wider, and the pyramid will look less like a pyramid and more like a rectangle or a square. And as it does that, it means we'll have fewer young age dependents and more old age dependents. And many of us will be in that, and we pay into Social Security, and we have an older population has implications for vulnerability, one of which is climate change, as does the younger populations. But age distribution matters too in many ways, and I'll come to why these things matter in a few slides. So it's important to understand that today's urbanization is a little bit different than urbanization in yesteryear. It differs because we now have something called urban giganticism. We have urban agglomerations and a continuum of urban rather than a simple urban-rural dichotomy. And this is the urban-rural dichotomy is that simple circle in a circle, but the continuum is more a constellation of cities and towns as part of a larger agglomeration. And this is what we empirically can observe now, and perhaps this was also true in the past, but it's increasingly true in the future. Migration to cities, we typically think of migration as something that has happened from rural areas to urban areas, but in fact now migration to cities is largely from other cities and towns. And it's also important to note that all cities are not alike. There's a lot of heterogeneity in the demographic and socioeconomic profile of urban dwellers and of cities themselves. So clarifying each of those points a little bit, urban giganticism. Here we have, I'm guessing this thing in the middle is the pointer is, okay, I won't use the pointer. Do you know which is the pointer? Nah. So there is, under the more developed regions, we can see that there are lots of cities there are about 100 cities presently of roughly 1 million or more, and that will probably be the same by 2025. However, in the developing world, farther over, we see that we have currently less than 250 or so. We have roughly 250 cities of 1 million or more. However, by the year 2025, that number will close to double. And some of those cities will be very large indeed. Where are they? Well, a lot of them are in China and India. And this is a map of India. In the year 2000, India had 40 cities of 1 million or more, 6 of which were 6 million or larger. And these are shown, and I'm sorry that it's a little hard to see with the sunlight. We're lucky to have sunlight on a cold day, but these are cities shown using several overlays, and I will explain what they are. The colors of the blobs are actually nighttime lights-based urban extents that are part of the Global Rural Urban Mapping Project, which is a database produced here at Columbia University. They're overlaid with those tan hues by an aridity layer, and at the edges it's a little hard to see, but then there's a low elevation coastal zone which shows proximity to seaward hazards, and again, I'll explain a little bit more about those. And understanding where the cities are just tells us a little bit about their vulnerability. Now, we can look presently at the contour of a city and all the cities of the world now. We couldn't do this 10 years ago. And going forward, using a new class of econometric methods and multi-level analysis, we lose the spatial rendering of the city, but we can say something about city growth. And as it turns out, by 2050, India will have 4 cities which are 20 million or more, 3 of which are coastal. And another 11 cities of 5 million or more, all of which are either in coastal or arid zones. We also know that larger cities grow more slowly than small cities. Small cities are growing more rapidly, and that fertility increase is a large cause of city growth. We can't say as much about migration yet, but we're working on that. But being able to put these cities in their spatial context and talk about their growth in spatial context allows us to prepare for their for vulnerability and a sustainable development profile. And we can't really do this with just the social science data inputs. The social science community needs to, and the data community at large needs to work toward integrating satellite and other spatial information to understand these changes. So the work has to be interdisciplinary between the traditional spatial users and the traditional non-spatial users of urban data. This simple pie diagram is simply to say that among urban dwellers in cities of 100,000 or more persons, only 12% live in the megacities. The megacities are a big part of the attention that we get, but in fact, they're really only a small fraction of all city dwellers. In fact, a far larger percentage of persons live in small cities. And since those are the cities that are going to be growing, it's important to understand how they're growing. This series will show us where people are migrating from. This is a handful of African countries from which we have demographic and health survey data. And this is people in the prime migration ages between 15 and 49. These are the green bars show the proportion of persons moving from villages into cities. This bar adds the people moving from towns. And this shows the people moving from other cities to cities. So again, the orange and the red bars are really quite a bit larger than the green stack, telling us that most of that movement is coming not from villages, not from rural areas, but that people are either moving between towns and cities or circulating between towns and cities. Again, changing the nature of who's doing the migration. But there's some basic things we still don't understand about today's urbanization. We really don't know where that growth is going to occur. We don't know if it'll be on the periphery of cities. We don't know if it will be vertical. We don't know if it'll be in slums. We don't so much know about the causes of city growth, though I did tell you that fertility is a large cause. It's a much harder proposition to put migration into these models. We don't know so much about the composition of city growth, particularly about the poor, where the poor will live, for example, in various aspects of understanding urban poverty as opposed to rural poverty, because usually data are collected with just one measure of poverty altogether. So, there are important differences between what it is to be poor in a city and what it is to be poor in a rural area. So we don't understand some of that composition, and those things will be important going forward because the poverty also influences one's vulnerability and adaptive capacity, of course, to things like climate shocks and other environmental hazards. And also importantly, we do not know precisely where climate change impacts will occur or who will be affected by those. And we've been working toward that domain. And so I would like to put this urban growth in the context of climate change. And work has been done both on the emissions scale and then to look at mitigation efforts, as well as on the adaptive side and on vulnerability. Very briefly on emissions, that's a model of emissions where you have aging. You assume that aging and urbanization might impact how we produce emissions. This is work of colleagues at NCAR, and it shows that in the green bars that as we have more urbanization now and toward 2050, urbanization will lead to greater emissions. Now, this is not a per capita basis, but just the phenomena of more people living in cities and economies that are urban will lead to will increase carbon emissions. On the other hand, an older population, aging, will lead to a decline in carbon emissions. So together, these are somewhat offset, but of course, if something like retirement age were to change, that would actually probably reduce the lowering impact of aging. This is not to say that if everybody lived in a distributed fashion evenly across the globe, you would probably have even greater emissions than we have here, but there is something about urbanization. Even though there are great economies of scale, an urban economy is one that has greater emissions, according to these modelers. Similarly, when we look at climate downscaling, we can look at a population distribution here. This is a model out to 2100. The red shows basically looks like this map of cities, and then we can put that, those are 4 different models showing the population by distance to coast in Florida roughly in 2100. And the takeaway message, there are 2. One is that models vary a lot from one to another, and it's important to have a lot of different models and to debate them in the public and academic discourse. And the second is that almost everybody in Florida lives pretty close to a seacoast. So estimating populations at risk, this is work that I've been involved in with colleagues here at Columbia University and elsewhere. And we look at populations at risk in the low elevation coastal zone, LECZ is written there. And I'm just going to show you what the ingredients of this look like, because you might see a number, but behind those numbers are a lot of very finely detailed spatial inputs, such as irregular administrative units. These are commune level data for Vietnam. Those are the Grump urban extents that I showed earlier. Those show cities in Vietnam. This is that low elevation coastal zone. And then this is a close-up for Ho Chi Minh City. And because these data are not naturally in a regular grid, we have to grid them in order to perform these, to perform the analysis. And so that is, again, a computational demand. When we do this, we see that roughly 1 out of every 10 persons in the world lives in this low-lying coastal area at risk of seaward hazard. And perhaps more importantly for our urban century, 1 out of every 8 persons lives within close proximity to seacoast, in low-lying areas, not at high cliffs. And a great deal of those persons are in Asia. 466 million persons are in Asia in general, and of those 360 million urban dwellers. So it's less than 10 years that we've been able to produce estimates like this, and like these populations at risk by whether somebody's urban or not, by these various ecological zones and low elevation characteristics. And we do this and we produce, this is a country table that can come out, and these tables have been reported and are in the press and so forth. And again, it shows that the populations with very high numbers of persons in the zone, as well as some with very high percentages, are predominantly found in Asia. Those are the top 10 there, and almost all of them are Asian countries. But increasingly, we can do city-specific estimates, and we can do a better job now of understanding coastal hazards because we have better data on coastal hazards. And so here we see, for example, for 2 countries, Bangladesh and Vietnam, at 3 meters, we see quite a number of urban residents at risk. And particularly, and in both countries, there are more urban dwellers than rural dwellers who are at risk of seaward hazards by these scenarios. It's also important to note that this is, though I'm stressing Asia as being a focus of this, 70% of all countries that have any land that are not landlocked, essentially, so all countries that are not landlocked make this up, 70% have their largest city in this low-lying area. So New York is among them. New York, LA, are, for example, and are 2 of the cities in the United States that are in this low-lying area. Because this is a geographic audience, I want to make the point that resolution really matters. And here's the case of Vietnam. You saw those fine-scale data. When you do this analysis with, and it's probably not visible on, I can't really see from here, but maybe you can. If you use something like province-level data, which is how the social science community sort of organizes its data, you would find that you would end up with a 25% or 12 million person estimate too few of people at risk of this in this low-lying coastal zone. And the effects locally are much, much greater. So we really need to push national statistical offices and computational power to be using the finest scale data available. And what you may not know is that these data are typically only available for total population counts, but we care about much more, like young age and old age distributions, estimates of some kind of well-being indicator. And those are rarely available at these. But without this scale, we are going to we will come up with estimates that are wrong. Or more wrong, I should say. These data can then, because they're spatial, be used with other spatial data, and this is just an analysis that was published a few years ago by a large team to look at urban water storage. And in fact, the places you see, again, pretty strong future, this is water storage, urban water availability and shortages, We see in 2050, we expect that population will drive urban water shortage. After that, these countries will bear the full impact of climate change. And that's what this analysis has shown. But again, it cannot be done in the absence of spatial information. Simple national level tables will not allow you to do these kinds of analyses. So I would like to just spend a couple minutes and then and I'll conclude saying why engagement in the social science is limited. I think the methods and materials of demography, for example, where population resides, and a lot of the related social sciences are largely aspatial. And geography alone does not actually cover the gamut and methods of some of those disciplines, so greater engagement across the social science. And actually GIS is a great way for facilitating that exchange because it's so accessible. But climate science and sustainability science is often seen as outside the domain of most social sciences, oddly. And even though that's not true with probably many of those of whom are here, but in general, within the silos of each discipline, they typically are. Even those interested in policy. So the greater engagement is needed. And one of the reasons, I don't want to spend much time on this, but the way demographic and social science data are collected is largely through either administrative unit that for which microdata is harder to access, or for survey data which are not representative, for example, at the level of the city. And this makes it very difficult to do some kinds of spatial analysis. However, in the developing world, those points, those blobs are, the points there show locations from the demographic health survey data where they've used GPS data to find the survey cluster. And then those survey clusters can be combined with other urban extents. Those are the GRUMP urban extents. And they can be classified, and these linkages allow us to say something more about cities. So these materials are increasingly becoming available and increasingly being used across discipline. And this is such an example of one of them. This is a new database out of the JRC in Europe. The gray hues are the low elevation, a refined low elevation coastal zone from that Columbia season has produced. The darker hues tell us something about built-up area coming out of JRC, and this is roughly the year 2000. And the big red blob is that GRUMP extent. So that's where people have, this is built up area in 2014, that's 14 years later. And it's a little hard to see, but these, the dots overlaying them are the demographic health survey data, which tell us something about individuals' wealth. And what you can't see so well, the green dots are the relatively wealthy individuals in Dhaka, the red dots are the relatively poor persons. And in the lower corner on your right-hand side of the built-up area, the newly built-up area, happens to have people who show up as being much more relatively poor in this setting. So and as we can, it's a little hard to see again, but it is well within a low elevation area. I think it's within the it's like the 6 to 7 meter range. Just so you know, New York City uses roughly 5 meters as its emergency planning measure, and Bangladesh floods constantly, so, and Dhaka gets a lot of flooding. This is a well-flooded area annually. It has annual flooding, and this is the area that has seen, again, the great deal of change over the last 15 years, and to increasingly vulnerable individuals. So moving forward, I think on the social science and demographic side, there needs to be this reorientation from national level urban trends to cities that are systematically collected and in a framework that can be used across many disciplines. Cities need to be placed into spatial context. We can't just talk about urban fractions or urban strata anymore. We should borrow strength from satellite and other spatial data. This will foster a much better understanding of a full range of the urban continuum and demographic behaviors that are important to sustainable development in the 21st century, and including those that we need to prepare for climate adaptation, among others. Thank you.
Thank you. How are we doing on time? Let's, I think if there's any questions, I think we'll address them after each speaker. So if somebody has a specific question that Deborah can address, feel free to ask a quick question, please.
I was interested, you said that smaller cities are growing faster. I was interested that you said smaller cities are growing faster. Is that on an absolute or percentage basis? Obviously, 100,000 people matters more to a city of 500,000 than to a city of 10 million.
It's a percentage.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, so big cities could easily have another million persons, but if they're already a large city, it may be, or 500,000 people to a large city is a lot less than 500,000 people to a city of 500,000. So, yeah.
Thanks.
Anything else? Great. We'll have time during the breaks, I think, if you want to bring up anything specifically with the speakers. I think that was a great example of how non-geographers are contributing to the discourse on this. Alec and I were talking last night actually about, I didn't want to oversell the fact that it's only geographers that have contributions to make. It's just the lack of their contributions. So thank you very much for your perspective. Again, you all have your bios, so I'm not going to spend any time taking away from our speakers, introducing them. Alec Murphy.
Thank you, Lee. It's wonderful to be here. Back for me, again, like Lee, back at Columbia, I did a law degree about a block and a half away from this building. I walked by it many times. It was a previous endeavor before I saw the light and went to get a PhD in geography at the University of Chicago. But it's great to be back. I'm the second one on the left up there. Lee's the one on the far left. But in all seriousness, it's wonderful to look out at this great and diverse audience, business people, people from government, academia. I was sitting up here and I looked out and there's one of my students from 20 plus years ago. Hi, Marianne. Sitting in the audience. What a great assemblage across traditional communities. So my job on this triumvirate of population, identity, and well-being is to do the identity piece. Of course, identity can mean very different things to very different people. And we can talk about identity in terms of gender or familial role or all sorts of other things. But the kind of identity that I'm going to focus on today is really the kind of cultural political identity that we associate with nationalism and sub-state efforts to carve out more autonomy or independence for them. And of course, when we think about that issue historically, we recognize that since time immemorial, there's been a strong link between identity and territory. So whether thinking about older tribal territories, or we think about shogunates in medieval Japan, or feudal territories in France, or whatever, we can think about the link between territory and identity as being very strong. And of course, this all got scaled up to the scale of the state, starting in the 15th and 16th centuries with the rise of the modern state system. And so we came increasingly to think about identity in state terms. To be a French person is somebody to live in France, even though, of course, France is an amalgamation of all sorts of people, just like every place else is. And so naturalized did this notion of identity become that we now sort of think about this as not just the default political map of the world, but the default map of peoples. Who lives in Gabon? Well, the Gabonese. Well, they speak 42 different languages and so forth, but that's the way we think about it. This way of thinking about the relationship between territory and identity is so embedded that we term these units on a map like these nation states. A nation originally was a group of people who felt themselves to be one based on a sense of common culture and identity. A state is a politically organized area. So even though there are many, many more nations on this that are behind a map like this than are shown on a map like this, we consider it to be a map of nation states. And I guess you could say, here's the map labeled Nations of the World. We don't see Kurds and we don't see Palestinians and so forth. We see the states of the world. Well, that's where we've come through the 20th century. But now, of course, we're in an era of some significant changes. Significant changes that are associated with globalization and a set of interconnections that are existing around the planet that really are unprecedented in some ways. What's driving then the questions, or these sorts of changes, are driving some of the questions we're trying to ask about identity as we're looking forward to the world of 2050. What's driving these questions are things like the sheer intensity of connections that transcend traditional territorial arrangements. And those, this is internet usage. It looks like the dynamic aspect of this map isn't working, but it's the intensity of connections that transcend traditional territorial identities, the incredible intensity of mobility around the world. I mean, a 24-hour map showing the movement of peoples just by airplane is really fantastic. The unprecedented levels of migration that are going on around the world. The spatial disaggregation of production, where now the Made in America car you buy has components from 30-odd countries around the world. And of course, the new regional linkages that exist. The fact that I sit in my office on a typical morning at the University of Oregon and I'm in communication with people in China and Japan and Israel and France and so forth. All of this has the potential fundamentally to change some of the ways we've thought about the identity territorial linkage. It suggests that, at least to some extent, we may be entering a new, boy, this is a sensitive button. Can I get it to do what I want it to do? There. So it's changing to some extent how we're thinking about the territory identity linkage. We're starting in some circles to talk about the possibility of entering a deterritorialized world or a post-territorial world. And it does seem that way for some people. When I think about what I do, what many of you do, I'm sure on a daily basis. That thinking about a deterritorialized world is in fact part of what was behind a book that got a lot of attention a little while ago, of course, Thomas Friedman's Flat World. The conceit of that book is, in fact, that we're entering into a world where traditional territorial arrangements don't matter so much. But it's not an uncontested view of the world by far. In fact, it relies both on some pretty heroic generalizations about regional differences and the assumption that territory is not a critical component of identity. And again, every time I hit the button, I seem to advance twice, so I'm sorry about that. But this Far Side cartoon, I've always liked it. And now Randy, by use of song, the male sparrow will stake out his territory, an instinct common in the lower animals, and you can see the context in which it's existed. So I think one has to ask some serious questions about the extent to which we really are entering a post-territorial world. And in fact, the events of the last couple of decades have not been particularly suggestive that's where we're going. You know, the Arab Spring was not rooted in political aspirations about Islam. It was, in fact, related very much a focus of what's happening in Tunisia, what's happening in Egypt, what's happening in Bahrain. What's going on in places like Ukraine today is, of course, a very territorial affair. Territory is hardly marginal to an issue of Crimea or what's going on in the southeastern part of Ukraine. There's a wonderful map that was done for the New York Times, if I can brag, by one of my former students, Derek Watkins, who now works for the New York Times in their graphics department. The growing fortification of the world through borders. This is a French map just showing how many new walls and fortified borders there are around the world. We're actually farther down that line now than we were 20 years ago. The fact that movements seeking to change the current political territorial order are in fact about not creating a post-territorial order, but changing the boundaries. So you get sub-state movements that are struggling not, again, for some sort of post-territorial world, but for a territory of their own. And when questions come up about, can we have some kind of non-territorial or not less traditional territorial arrangements to deal with issues and problems like parallel statehood concepts or joint sovereignty concepts, these are really the exception rather than the rule. Even something like the experiment with European integration, which in theory is one of the ways in which we're changing the modernist political territorial order, have really fallen very much victim to the traditional territorial dynamics that are part of the modern state system. Consider Wim Duisenberg's statement just at the beginning of the Euro experiment. What was this experiment supposed to do? According to Wim Duisenberg, it was going to be a symbol of the future integration of 300 million people and will change the way in which we think about one another as Europeans. Well, that hasn't exactly worked out as planned. In fact, the Eurobarometer surveys that gauge levels of identity with Europe or with individual states shows, if anything, an uptick in state-based identity recently. And of course, the financial crisis has led to a great exacerbation of interstate tensions and a renewed focus on what's going on in Germany versus Greece versus Italy and so forth. Even the most non-territorial activity, well, one of the more non-territorial activities known as tweeting. When you actually map tweeting, and I hope you can see this, it's one of those days when I was actually hoping for clouds, given the ambient light in this rotunda. I mean, that map looks like a political map of Europe, because in fact, the spatiality of tweeting is still very much circumscribed by the traditional map of states. So I would suggest that we're probably not going to be headed for a non-territorial world in the next 35 years. I think it's much more likely we're going to still be headed towards a world where territories matter. But the question is, what kind of territories, what kind of stability might go with this? Now, it's a little bit, well, it's more than a little bit. It's quite hazardous to think we can say a lot profound about the world 35 years from now. I remember, I was mentioning this to a couple people last night, I remember reading an article recently that talked about some folks in 1900 who were trying to say, what are the next 2-3 decades going to be like? And it was an analysis of what they said that was going to be happening and what happened, and they missed almost all the major trends. World War I, the Depression, the development of the airplane, I mean, we could go on and on. So it's a pretty hazardous endeavor. On the other hand, I think we can sketch out tendencies and we can talk about things that might push things in one way or another. And I want to suggest that if we are in fact heading towards a future where territories still matter, we might think about it as two kinds of extremes. On the one kind of extreme, one level, we could have a relatively stable territorial system, not nearly as entrenched perhaps as the modernist system is, in part undercut by all the kinds of new arrangements that are out there, and maybe just some relatively minor boundary changes from what we see today. On the other side of the spectrum, we can see a very unstable world, highly entrenched territorial systems, major boundary changes, pretty disruptive. Now, at the risk of discouraging or depressing anybody who's here today, unfortunately, I think there are a number of factors that are pushing things actually in the right-hand direction on the chart that is up here. Those factors range from increasing sub-state uprisings to intensified defensive state nationalism to the kinds of anti-state insurrections that we see in movements like ISIL or ISIS, if you prefer. So when we might ask, what are the kinds of circumstances that are likely to foster those kinds of things? Well, in this regard, I think if we're thinking about the propensity for increased sub-state uprisings, we can think about a combination of states dominated by one ethnic group with ethnic minorities that feel marginalized in some way. So it's not simply a map of ethnic diversity that's going to tell us that what's going to go on. It's the dynamics between a majority and a minority. So we can look at a lot of African states and we can say, well, they're very ethnically diverse, but they don't necessarily have quite the ingredients that, let's say, Burma or Myanmar, if you prefer, has, with a dominant ethnic group and marginalized sub-state groups that are increasingly showing signs of disquietude, to put it mildly, with their state of affairs. Or as Central Asia, racked by the kinds of ethno-political dynamics that could well lead to a repeat of the Tajik Civil War from 15, 20 years ago. Or Southwest Asia, where it's not actually too far-fetched to think about a Southwest Asia that within 25, 30 years, might actually look a little bit like this Peters map from 7, 8 years ago that got so much discussion at the time, particularly when we start thinking about places like Pakistan and obviously what's going on in Iraq today. Even Russia, for all of Putin's popularity, has the dynamics of course, a dominant ethno-territorial identity on the part of the dominant group and ethnic minorities that would point in this direction. Now, what about the propensity for intensified state nationalism? And in this case, I think it also can very likely increase in response to some things that are not too far-fetched that are going on. Geopolitical shifts, migration coupled with economic concerns, and environmental challenges. So just to look at each of these things briefly, of course, geopolitical concerns. I don't know whether I have a heavy thumb or whether this is just hypersensitive, but I'm doing my best. On the geopolitical shifts front, of course, a lot of our focus of attention is in places like Ukraine today. But the role of EU and NATO expansion, of course, is all part of the backdrop to what's been going on here. The sense of Russia being surrounded is not irrelevant to the picture. In the South China Sea, China's increasing assertiveness in the face of its rising power and the tensions that that's bringing about with Vietnam and the Philippines and so forth is actually helping to stoke state nationalism in China and in these other countries. When we come to migration or economic concerns, here it's the mix of the two that can often be so key to giving rise to greater state nationalism, as this cartoon before you suggests. All of this may well be exacerbated by something that I think is getting not the attention that it deserves, which is simply the trend towards ever greater mechanization, which is intimately tied with the issue of employment. So as we head towards the mechanization of more and more functions, I was reading just on the way here about will taxis 10 years from now actually be driven by human beings? And then I began wondering, well, what are all those Somalis in Minneapolis going to be doing for their work? But that's only the tip of the iceberg. Mechanization is going to be one of the issues pushing actually employment issues into a place where we actually may be seeing more insecurities about jobs and job prospects than was the case in the past. So when those become particularly toxic, when they are taking place in the context of societies with lots of external migrants, where it's easy to see the migrants as ones taking the jobs, in turn feeding into this sense of intensified state nationalistic concerns. And you can see this very vividly, of course, in the Europe of today. I just can't do it. There we go. No. Where you can see this very much in the Europe of today. Here's the Islamophobe map of Europe, where a place like Belgium, even though only 6% of the population is Muslim, the dynamics now around the Muslim population in Belgium and its potential implications for the future of the state have given rise to far-right parties and new social dynamics that, if anything, are sort of intensifying the territorial instincts that have long been there. And then there's the issue of environmental challenges. We're seeing on the environmental front things that are also relevant to this whole issue of the relationship between territory and identity. We're already seeing novel alliances, such as this alliance of small island states, but we're also seeing in the face of climate change, and we already had some introductions to some of the issues facing there. We're seeing environmental migrants going from Bangladesh, for example, to India that are exacerbating border questions along that border and raising questions about the future of state nationalism in those areas as well. And then finally, the propensity for anti-state insurrections potentially can rise in regions where you get the combination of weak dysfunctional states, widespread alienation or senses of oppression, and messianic, in the general sense of that term, not the Christian sense, cultural ideological movements that have some kind of traction. And here almost it's hard to not say that the Middle East has got the perfect storm, in a sense, going. It's got a storm going that is a product of course, a historical decline in its global position, as suggested by this graph, facing some very serious contemporary problems. This is a map of current unemployment. You can see that the Middle East, Southwest Asia really sticks out on the employment front. A sense of being controlled from outside by hegemonic oppressive influences, whether it's back in the colonial days or in the contemporary military scene. Dysfunctional states that are overlying a sort of deep-seated cultural historical animosities, Sunni Shia being only the tip of the iceberg. So it's not a particularly encouraging picture then for where I would suggest the world might want to be in 2050 in terms of this diagram that I laid out just a few minutes ago. So I want to just end this morning with some thoughts about how we could potentially get back towards the other side of the spectrum. And here I think is where geography has such an incredibly important role to play. And I just want to give 2 or 3 examples to wind things out, because I think if we can actually rise to some of the challenges of greater geographic sensitivity and understanding that Jerry Dobson and Lee Schwartz were talking about this morning, we'll be in a better position to push that arrow farther to the left than farther to the right. So in one sense, what geography can bring is an analysis of spatial relationships that can promote understanding of political sources of ethno-nationalist conflict. And I think, here the whole situation of Iraq is so useful to understand, even in historical perspective. I remember getting up at a forum at my university just after the U.S. went into Iraq, and we had already had a debate over whether the U.S. should go in, and now it's, all right, now we're in, what should we be paying attention to? And I'd spent some time working on the region, but it wasn't even my main area of specialty, and I remember saying, well, one of the key things to think about is how the different ethno-national or the different ethnic communities, how they are going to be feeling about their position in the state that they're inheriting. Which might mean, first of all, several things: trying to keep together nationalist institutions like the Army. Well, almost everybody acknowledges that was a mistake to disband the Army. But also just looking in a simple way. You don't need a fancy GIS to look at where the oil resources are and where the traditional groups are. And the fact that the group in green in the middle there was the one in power, and it's not where the oil lay, that, some important questions lay around there that got far too little attention. Or thinking about the kinds of spatial patterns that exist in countries that might distinguish a Cairo or an Egypt from a Muscat. Now, both of these areas are, of course, areas where authoritarian regimes are at play, but only one of them has been the scene of major uprisings over the course of the last several years, and that, of course, is Egypt. And some of the ingredients for that very much lie in the incredible socioeconomic disparities that exist within that country. We might have been not quite so surprised by what went on there if we had been paying a little bit more attention to that. And then there's the importance of thinking critically about approaches to dividing up the world that can promote better understanding of the nature of geopolitical divides, and that can, in fact, challenge stereotypes that we have. This map, or some version of it, of course, was the way that Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations was mapped some time ago. And I remember, even when it came out, just sort of thinking, what does it mean to actually take the big green space on this map and just sort of treat that as a single geopolitical block, when in fact the kinds of things I've been paying attention to are all the boundary conflicts within this area and some of the cultural political conflicts within this area. To use the notion of a simple Islamic bloc as a useful geopolitical trope can actually raise some serious questions. As can the failure to think about something like this is not to justify the Russian takeover of Crimea, but what did it mean, actually, to expand NATO right up to the borders of Russia, a Cold War institution, and to have that be the front end of what might be happening in Ukraine? How does this actually feed into the changing understandings that different countries have of what's going on in the region? And then finally, to challenge some of the stereotypes that are out there about the world. Yes, this is one view of Iran, so is this. And then the last point I would make is by highlighting the connections. Geography can be important by highlighting the connections that can help us anticipate problems. And here I can think back to the environmental arena again. Rising sea levels is not just an issue for the populations living along seacoasts. It's also a geopolitical question, because we actually control or measure our territorial rights to seacoasts by baselines based on where high-level waters are. Those are changing. Some anticipation of that issue might help us actually think ahead about some issues that are going to affect the future of the South China Sea in the decades to come. So there it is. It's because of the insights that can come from these sorts of things that I think it's incredibly important to think about how geography can contribute to understanding the changing planet, the focus of a National Research Council study I had the pleasure of chairing a couple of years ago. It's why the kind of exercise we're engaged in today I think is so critically important, and why I appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alec. And I'm told to try to get us back on track, we're not going to have any questions, so we'll hold everything until the break, and we'll move right into our third speaker in the triad of population identity and well-being, Dr. Kruk, right here from the Millman School of Public Health. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Schwartz, and good morning, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm not a geographer. I was invited to speak about global public health and the trends going forward. So I'm excited to do that today. Let me see, are my slides almost up? No? Yes? Just give them one moment. Let me just tell you a bit about my work. I study health systems, actually, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, where, as we know from the news today, a lot is happening and a lot is changing very, very quickly. And in fact, the main message of my presentation today is about the many trends promoting convergence in health in ways that are good and bad for human health going forward in the next 20 years or so. So while you are looking ahead at 2050 in geography, we in global public health are perhaps less clairvoyant or ambitious and have only sought to look forward to 2035 to try to understand the trends that are going on in global health. And I think I was intrigued by, Dr. Schwartz, your description of human geography, when I think that's really I think global public health is foundationally concerned with human geography and the shifts that are going on in that area. Now, I do think my slides would help the exposition, but no slides. Okay, well then, you know what might be helpful to me is just to grab my slide. Yeah, I've got them right here. Just give me 1 second. Didn't think I would need those. Okay. All right. So in the past year, I've been a member of a commission called the Commission on Investing in Health. And this is an effort launched by The Lancet and the World Bank to examine the future trends in global health. And the nickname for our commission is Global Health 2035. We published a report in The Lancet last December describing those trends and projecting ways to look ahead in health. So let me just say a bit about this. What was the impetus for this effort? Why now? Well, back in 1993, the World Bank, not a health institution, took upon itself the task of investigating the value of investing in health. For a very long time, to my colleagues in economics, the notion of health was that it is a source of drainage to the economy. It's a drain on the economy. It is not an investment in the economy. And in 1993, the World Bank took another look to see whether investing in health, improves health in fundamental ways, what are the best investments to make, but also whether those investments have effects above and beyond health, whether they, for example, have investments in economic growth. Jeffrey Sachs, the head of the Earth Institute, was one of the people involved in that line of work for many, many years, of course, as well. So back in '93, the World Bank concluded that, yes, investing in health is great for the economy as well as for people's well-being, and promulgated a set of cost-effective interventions that we should be pursuing to improve health globally. There were lots of, I won't detail the fights and controversies that emerged from that 1993 report, but just to say that 20 years later, some of the originators of that report, including Professor Larry Summers, who was then head of the bank, decided to re-look again at the case for investing in health. And so we put together a commission of 25 economists and global health experts that worked for a year to, again, reinvestigate the case for investing in health, as well as looking at the future trends. So one of the very dramatic observations that we made is how has the world changed in 20 years since the original '93 report? Well, one of the ways the world has changed is, I think, despite all our grumblings about the evils of globalization and the losers in globalization, one inescapable fact is that there's been tremendous economic progress globally. China, of course, is responsible for some of that. India, other countries are responsible for some of that. But the proportion of countries that are labeled as low income in the globe has shrunk dramatically. Back in '93, over half the countries in the world, half the population in the world, lived in countries that were classified as low income, versus in 2013, when it was closer to 10, 15%. Now, why? It's not that those people became rich, but they moved into the lower middle income and middle income countries. And what that does is it changes the possibilities for those people, not just for the education of their children and hunger and poverty, but also for health. And so our commission identified 3 main domains of health challenges that exist today in 2014, 2015. First are the high rates of avertible maternal child deaths, as well as infectious diseases. So for 20 years, 50 years, we've been struggling with the same exact problems, making progress on some and little progress on others, with the effect that by 2015, we are still, or end of 2014, we are still at a point where countries and people are dying of diseases that have long been conquered and treated in the rich world. And we call this the traditional health agenda. And I have my slides, and we can have a look together. Hang on. Okay, so I was showing you the wealth. Oops. Okay, somebody's controlling my slides. Stop it. Okay. All right. I'm having your problem. All right, so this is what I wanted to focus on right now. The first domain of health challenges, these high rates of avertible, and I really want to stress avertible, infectious child and maternal deaths. We call this the unfinished agenda. Should have been long finished, it's not finished. Second is there is an emerging agenda on global health, which has to do with the demographic changes and shifts in the global burden of disease towards non-communicable diseases and injuries, and apologies for those acronyms up there. But again, many of those trends have already been described by previous speakers. And finally, there is also a cost agenda or an economic agenda, which is this. Not only is impoverishment bad for your health, but getting health care can impoverish you. So the notion that people are actually spending tremendous sums of money, sometimes money they can't really afford, to access health care. It's a hugely valuable service for people all around the globe, and it is impoverishing people, not just in Africa, but right here in the US. And so you're geographers, you're familiar with the land area of the world, but perhaps you haven't looked at the world in this way, which is an adjustment of the world map by the burden of preventable or avertible disease. And so really what you're seeing on this map is the map, again, controlled for, adjusted for, where the deaths are due to diseases that are today treatable. Okay, so these deaths, in fact, shouldn't be happening. If we had global health equity, we would see that previous map reproduced here again. But instead what we see is Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and India, dominating the world in terms of avertible deaths. And I think what's happening is it's advancing 2 slides every time. Yeah, can you advance? Okay, I'll just do something. Advance, please. Okay, so in contrast, and this is back to the cost agenda, I'd like you to look at this map, which shows where global health spending is. Can we go back a slide again? So this is the preventable deaths, look at that, and let's go ahead, and the government health spending. It's as if you held a mirror around the equator, really, to these two sets of data. So what's happening here is that we're spending money precisely where the deaths are not, actually. And although we are all concerned with our health and surviving to the longest possible age, what we see is a tremendous global inequality in disease burden, particularly galling because the diseases that I'm describing in those low-income countries are diseases that are cheap to actually prevent and treat. Next slide, please. And so tackling this first domain of the unfinished health agenda requires attention to low and middle income countries. It is not just about the poorest. This map shows you, for example, child deaths and tuberculosis deaths, and you'll see that that poor countries in the blue are certainly a big part of the problem, but low middle income countries, and even just India by itself, huge contributors to these excess deaths of children. Next, please. All right, so what do we come up to? This is the synopsis, the one-slide summary of this massive year-long effort with my many colleagues. We had 4 key messages from Global Health 2035, so you know you don't have to look up the paper anymore. The first is that there is an enormous payoff from improvements to health. We conducted new analysis, and in fact, it was a great privilege to work with Professor Kenneth Arrow, who is still vigorous and active in this area in his 80s and 90s. I didn't ask his age. But he is an incredible resource in this area, and has made the statement in one of our meetings that he's not a health economist, but he's become one as he ages, because he's realized the huge value of health that is measured above and beyond economic growth. There's an additional value people place on health that has nothing to do with their salary or income. Second, a grand convergence is possible around these avertible deaths, meaning we can bring all countries to the point of the best achieving countries in terms of under 5 mortality and infectious disease mortality. The third message is fiscal policies are a powerful and underused tool to prevent and treat these diseases, as well as some of the new diseases coming on board. And lastly, there is a global movement, and those of you following some of the UN processes know there's a global movement to promote universal health coverage, so prepayment, insurance, to protect people from the costs of ill health. And that will be another means to the goals of Global Health 2035. Next, please. And so just a brief point about the value of health. Professor Arrow and his colleagues came up with a new term called full income. And full income, really, is a way to help economists make better choices around investing in health, making the point that health is worth it. Income growth plus the value of years gained in that same period of income growth are together what we call full income. And that if we look at progress among countries in these terms, health investments make a lot more sense. And by the way, when I say health investments, I'm not just talking about doctors and nurses. I am, of course, talking about promotion and prevention of disease in the first place as well, critically. Next, please. And I want to talk about divergence and convergence. Back in the 1700s, we were all, in fact, converging on health. And what you see here is under 5 mortality on the y-axis. And you can see Sweden and China having very similar under 5 mortality. Then for the many centuries that followed, there was a great divergence with rich countries dramatically lowering child mortality. Have a look at the new millennium, with China coming once again very close to Sweden in child mortality. And we see this among these best performing countries, among the lower income countries. China is one of the example countries we used in this report, along with Costa Rica, Chile, and Cuba, the 4C countries that we call them. Next, please. And what you see here is that it is in fact possible, if you follow the trajectories, the red line is these best performers, the 4C countries, and then the rest of poor countries, it is in fact possible to imagine a convergence over by 2035. Next, please. And you might say, well, where'd you get that from? That's wishful thinking. I just want to point out the case of Rwanda. Rwanda, a country, torn apart by civil war and massacre and bloodshed with HIV to fight, has now recorded the steepest fall in child mortality in human history ever. So this is a country that decided health is a priority after the bloodshed of the genocide, invested massively in health promotion, prevention, and treatment, dramatically reducing child mortality in that country to rich country levels. By the way, all teenagers in Rwanda are now protected against human papillomavirus, unlike 30% of teenagers here in the US. So we have a lot to learn. Next, please. And just to say, I won't belabor this, just to say that most of these gains that I'm describing are achievable with a modest additional investment, and the proportion of the health gap that could be closed with existing knowledge is actually quite high. So we don't need to invent a whole lot of new tools to make this happen. Next, please. There are a number of sources of income to fund this convergence agenda. very few countries will actually require foreign assistance. In fact, economic growth is so strong in many low-income countries. I could even have said this about Liberia until very recently, for example. Unfortunately, this epidemic is going to put a major damper on that. But the point is that this is an affordable price tag that countries could fund out of economic growth, out of taxing resources, out of taking away subsidies for fossil fuels, for example, and other sources. Next, please. And just to say that while we are thinking about hopeful convergence, converging on low rates of under 5 mortality, at the same time, the world is witnessing convergence on diseases of affluence. This is a map of diabetes in the world, and this is disability-adjusted life years, so it adds deaths to the disability caused by diabetes globally. And really, the colors are all washed out a little. Just want you to see, this is in 1990. The red indicates countries with high burden of death and disability, and blue, the darker blue, low burden. And see how much diversity there is in the world between these colors. Let's go to 2010, next slide. And what you can see now is, yes, Africa has still a low burden, but many of the other countries have now equaled out. And in particular, India and China are suffering huge epidemics of diabetes, which has become one of their top public health problems. Not under 5 mortality anymore, but diabetes. Next, please. And diabetes is just one of the many health threats that countries are jointly struggling to get a handle on. Depression is another huge contributor to global misery, if not death, global misery, as is cardiovascular disease, stroke, and injury, another huge area where there are now more traffic deaths per capita in Africa than there are in the US. Next, please. And so how do we get to the Global Health 2035 goals? One of the key mechanisms is that we do have to insure everyone against the cost of illness, as well as promoting and promoting good health and preventing disease. And universal health coverage is really the idea that we pool resources between rich and poor and get people insured so that when they do get ill, they're able to obtain the care they need. It's something that might sound familiar. The Affordable Care Act is something that has now bringing the US closer to this emerging global agenda. And I just want to end on this next slide, which just shows you that Thailand, a middle-income country with lots of economic shocks in its recent past, is a country that's decided to make investment in health a priority, that's decided that protecting its citizens against the cost of illness is a priority, an economic and health priority, and that has now achieved 100% coverage of its entire population against the cost of illness. Everyone in Thailand is insured. And with that, there are other slides that I don't have, but that show dramatic declines in under 5 mortality and also dramatic declines in catastrophic health spending that's going on in those countries. So just to come back to the notion of human geography and the ways that we are converging and the ways that we're still diverging, for example, the US versus Thailand, on critical issues such as promotion of health and prevention of catastrophic spending. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure if that's an optimistic or pessimistic view, but at least what's clear is that it's going to be an unequal future, so the spatial aspects of this are going to be important going forward. 3 quick points. First of all, don't forget to fill out your cards with your major trends. Please take advantage of the break to ask the speakers any questions. We're trying to get back on track, so we will break for 15 minutes. What time is it? I don't have a watch with me.
24 after.
It's now 24 after? All right. So let's go with 10:40. Does that make sense? And please join me in a healthy round of applause for our panel. It was a great panel. Thank you.